Picture this for a second. Imagine a massive, majestic ship. For centuries, it's been securely tethered to a deep, immovable anchor. But suddenly, that line snaps. It breaks free and starts to drift, slowly at first, straight into the fog of an open, unpredictable ocean. Well, today in this explainer, we're taking a look at a profound philosophical shift in human history that's a whole lot like that drifting ship. We are diving into the source material from Eroding the Foundations of Life and Value, which presents a pretty somber, urgent, intellectual postmortem on how Charles Darwin's theories completely altered Western philosophy. Our text argues that Darwin's ideas actually acted as a catalyst, basically cutting the anchor of traditional beliefs and setting society adrift on a sea of subjective ideologies. It is a really fascinating, heavy topic, so let's set sail and see exactly where this drift took us.
To truly unpack this shift, here is our roadmap for today. First, the drift from Imago Dei. Second, Darwin's historic voyage. Third, the genealogy of ideas. Fourth, the societal shipwreck. Fifth, the erosion of human worth. And finally, number 6, recognize, resist, restore.
All right, let's jump right in with Section 1, the drift from Imago Dei, losing the anchor.
To understand this drift, we really have to understand what the anchor was in the first place. For centuries, Western culture was grounded in a very specific foundational idea about human identity, rooted in this verse from Genesis. It establishes the concept of Imago Dei, the idea that humanity was created in the image of God. The source argues that this was the absolute anchored truth of Western culture. It's what provided the standard for human dignity, equality, and justice. But as the 19th century rolled around, this absolute truth started getting replaced by what the text brilliantly calls a Jack Sparrow compass. Instead of pointing to a true objective north, society's moral compass just started pointing towards subjective desires and purely naturalistic explanations.
Now, the catalyst for this massive societal shift can actually be seen by looking at the personal life of Charles Darwin himself. He was raised in a Christian environment, even studied theology at Cambridge, but his worldview underwent a total transformation. As he formulated his evolutionary theories, the source notes that he actually abandoned traditional Christianity for agnosticism. So his personal drift, from seeing a divine creator to seeing a strictly naturalistic universe, would ultimately become the blueprint for the modern world.
So, how exactly did this intellectual shift begin? Let's move to Section 2, Darwin's historic voyage, the HMS Beagle.
This whole thing started not in a dusty library, but out on the open ocean. In December of 1831, a young Charles Darwin set sail on the HMS Beagle for a 5-year odyssey. In 1832, down in Argentina, he unearthed fossils of long-extinct mammals, which really sparked his questions about the dynamic history of life on Earth. But the real light bulb moment happened in 1835 on the remote Galapagos Islands. He meticulously studied the local finches there, noticing these tiny, subtle variations in their beak shapes, with each one adapted perfectly to what they ate. By the time he finally returned to England in 1836, his head was just full of these revolutionary new ideas about adaptation and survival.
Over 20 years after that voyage, we hit Section 3, the genealogy of ideas, from micro to macro.
In 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And this is where we see the mechanics of his theory truly take shape. He essentially took observable micro-level adaptations and extrapolated them into a massive macroevolutionary worldview. The source points out how he used artificial selection, how humans intentionally breed plants and dogs for specific traits, to explain his new concept. He proposed natural selection, arguing that given enough time, nature could blindly do the exact same thing. He essentially opened the box of chance. Our text emphasizes that this removed the need for divine intervention entirely. It argued that chance and time, rather than a conscious creator, were responsible for the whole diversity of life.
But here's where it gets interesting. The text points out some pretty significant structural cracks in this theory of gradual macroevolution, and impartially notes that Darwin himself was completely aware of them. Look at his own words here. He openly admitted that the fossil record did not show the countless transitional species, those famous missing links, that his theory absolutely required. Darwin hoped that future generations would dig them up, but the source argues that these intermediate fossils are still glaringly absent today, which challenges the foundational premise of an unguided, gradual evolutionary chain.
To give us some modern context on this debate, the source contrasts Darwin's 19th century ideas with modern intelligent design arguments. They cite authors like Stephen C. Meyer, who argues that undirected chemical processes have literally never produced complex biological information systems like the digital code we now know exists in DNA. The text highlights this to suggest that the sheer staggering complexity of life points toward a common designer rather than just a blind, undirected process.
And that brings us to the real philosophical core of this explainer. The text identifies this specific concept as the central, bad idea born from Darwin's work, the idea that human beings have no inherent value. Think about it. If we are nothing more than the product of chance and cosmic accident, if we're just highly evolved animals who have been dethroned from our status as image bearers of God, then we don't hold any special, elevated place in the cosmos at all.
Now we have to shift into the impact phase of our analysis, with Section 4, the societal shipwreck, the fruit of Idea 2.
The source provides a really somber look at what happens when the ideology of survival of the fittest is pulled out of the jungle and applied directly to human society. We're looking at the tangible wreckage here. The text reports how Darwinian ideas gave pseudoscientific cover to some of history's darkest atrocities. For example, Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, coined the term eugenics. That led to movements encouraging the breeding of the fit and even forcibly sterilizing the unfit. Industrialists leaned on social Darwinism to justify ruthless, crushing business practices. Imperial powers used it to subjugate indigenous populations, and segregation laws were heavily bolstered by this belief that certain races were inherently inferior on the evolutionary scale.
And the source traces these societal impacts straight back to Darwin's own writings in his later book, The Descent of Man. Darwin himself wrote that Western European nations basically owed their dominance to natural selection. The author of our source material argues that this kind of logic inevitably concludes in racial hierarchies, because if we are just descendants of animals evolving at different rates, then the concept of equality totally vanishes. Only the fittest have the right to determine what is good, completely erasing the foundational concept of equal, inalienable human rights.
Beyond those historical atrocities, we also need to look at the modern psychological implications in Section 5, the erosion of human worth, determinism, and victimhood.
The text explains that a Darwinian worldview fosters what psychologists call an external locus of control. Basically, it's a deterministic mindset, where people believe they're just doomed by their genetics or their environment. It breeds a victim mentality, stripping away individual agency. The source contrasts this directly with the biblical view of human nature, which empowers an internal locus of control. Because humans are fundamentally unique from animals, in that view, we actually have the agency to defy our biological urges, rise above our natural inclinations, and actively reshape our world.
When humanity is viewed as just another animal species, the modern implications are huge. The text argues that Darwin essentially reduced morality to a mere social instinct that just developed to help the group survive. And if that's true, it denies the existence of any moral absolutes. If right and wrong are just evolutionary tools, they can just be changed by whoever happens to be in power. The source also links this worldview to modern debates, arguing that it justifies things like abortion and euthanasia by measuring human life by its utility rather than its inherent worth. It even points to the rise of ecofascism, where the protection of nature is actually prioritized over human rights and well-being.
So the absolutely crucial point is how we actually respond to this philosophical drift. That brings us to our final section, Section 6, Recognize, Resist, Restore, Finding the True North.
The source doesn't just leave us stranded in the wreckage of these ideas. It issues a clear call to action to find our true north once again. It presents a simple three-part framework. First, we have to recognize the drift. We need to understand how subjective desires have replaced anchored truths in our culture. Second, we must resist deterministic ideologies that reduce human beings to mere biological machines stripped of their own agency. And third, we must restore the concept of imago Dei. The author invites us to return to that foundational, historical idea that all humans are endowed with equal inherent dignity by a divine creator.
We'll wrap up this explainer with the ultimate question posed by the source material. It's a big one. Is your worth, your dignity, and your deep sense of justice simply the byproduct of millions of years of unguided cosmic chance and survival of the fittest? Or do you possess inherent value because you are part of an intentional, divine design? It's a heavy question for sure, but how you answer it changes absolutely everything about how you view the world and the people in it. Thanks for exploring this with us today.